Hi everyone! This week we'll be exploring two readings from two American writers, Mindy Kaling's Coming This Fall and David Foster Wallace's Consider the Lobster, as well as discussing general nonfiction, which is what we'll start with today. So, what is nonfiction? Nonfiction is a tricky genre to define. It is an incredibly broad category that accommodates the usual genres we think of when we think nonfiction. Memoir, biography, autobiography, and also others. Cultural studies, cookbooks, self-help, humor, religious essays, political rants, op-eds, journalism, manuals, analysis, magazine articles, academic articles, and reviews. The list could go on. However, the catch is this. Nonfiction is a genre that is defined by what it is not. It is not fiction. This is why so many writers within the nonfiction genre wish to be called essayists, because it's a term that better defines what they write rather than what they do not write. I'd like to mention here your first readings of the course, the first 3 chapters of The Elements of Style by E.B. White and William Strunk Jr. This is the golden book of grammar for writers, and I urge you, if you are indeed serious about writing, to read this at least once a year. In this course, I'd like to focus on the importance of correct grammar. Kurt Vonnegut, and many other writers, is known for breaking grammatical rules, but he studied those rules carefully and knew how to loosen each. So I'll be quizzing you on grammar from this book as we go along in this semester. So you will have to know how to use a comma and how to use an apostrophe. Writing, especially creative writing, whatever that means, is about the intention of your sentences. You want to be as specific as you can. Hence, know when to use a fragment or when to use a dash. Now, in the art of the short story, make sure to review The Elements of Short Fiction, which begins on page 849. We'll speak more to this chapter and these terms when we begin the fiction module, but there are terms that we'll be covering within this module. For instance, we'll be discussing exposition, climax, archetypes, motivation, point of view, setting, theme, and so on. Many of these terms both nonfiction and fiction share. So, with that in mind, let's turn our attention to our first author, Mindy Kaling. Kaling, of The Office and the Mindy Project fame, author of 2 books, one being published this year, is considered old hat in Hollywood, at least according to her. She's been writing for TV since 2004, when she began as the only female writer on the show The Office. She's often hailed as a humorist, not only because she writes for funny sitcoms, but also because she has her finger on the pulse of good commentary. She's clearly aware of industry cliches, as we'll read within Coming This Fall, and has been known for keeping the passé out of her scripts. In her essay published in The New Yorker, she responds to certain writing choices that have become overused. So, do these TV cliches still work? Well, it depends on the audience. American audiences prefer slapstick comedy to whip-based comedy. Herein lies the great difference between writing for American TV audiences and British TV audiences, and American audiences tend to prefer the familiar. Think of the old standby cliche of the incompetent but loving husband or father and the nagging, shrewish wife. Can you name a TV show? The classic setup of Everybody Loves Raymond, King of Queens, and Family Matters is a switch from the competent, long-suffering husband and the incompetent but lovable wife. Cue I Love Lucy. Now, both versions, regardless of who is more competent than the other, can be quite telling and reflective of the times. Television began to see the switch from the wife is incompetent to the husband is incompetent in the 1950s to 1970s. Now, we may go into why this was happening, from women having to enter and then make a forced exit of the workforce because of World War II, the changing dynamic of gender roles inside and outside the home, the fatherhood paradigm, whether or not TV shows portray fathers as a parent or portray them as a babysitter, something writer Sherman Alexie feels deeply offended about. But all of these potential reasons may be for another time. So instead, let's apply this dynamic to Kaling's piece. From these cliches, what can be teased out about current American culture? What commentary can be found in her section regarding the pilot of Boy Man? We see these shows and characters often enough on TV. So why do audiences seek this specific experience out? What do we find familiar in the boy man, who is often reshaped as a mama's boy, who cannot do his own laundry, or cook his own food, or generally take care of himself or others? Or look to the Abandoned Spinster Club pilot, and I'm sure you could name a few TV shows this is reflective of. Consider, again, cultural commentary and all of the hashtag-like mantras we adopt for certain gatekeeper ages. 40 is the new 30, 50 is the new 40, and when you reach 30, you must be, quote, 30, flirty, and fun, end quote. We may market ourselves, trying to prove one thing or another, but really, what's at stake for these characters? Often, the answer to this question is much more complex than the world these flat characters exist in. Does the boy man fear personal vulnerability and responsibility? Does he fear complicated emotion? Does he fear aging? And what about the abandoned spinster, as Kaling calls her? What does she fear? Decay? Death? I encourage you to read through these cliché choices often as you begin to sculpt not only your essay but also your story. If your story or essay is something we have read before, perhaps you were a terrific sports player in high school, but now not so much. Or perhaps you've had this really important self-discovery moment through camp or a job or church. Then what are you bringing, as we say, new to the table? So many new writers, especially nonfiction writers, think that they must immediately seize upon life-changing events or the most dramatic event that has happened in the past year. However, these essays end up often reading like college application essays. So instead, let yourself think about ordinary life and finding the extraordinary within. Share and translate the human experience. Now, David Foster Wallace, or as he is usually called, DFW, or Foster Wallace, was born in 1962 in Ithaca, New York. He is considered one of the greatest essayists, if not one of the greatest postmodern writers in recent history. He has spawned a new era of essay writing, a new appreciation of reporting, and some may joke, literary cults of devoted readers. And though critics say that he often appeals to young males specifically, I think his appeal extends across sexes, across genders, and across literary tastes. Whether or not we enjoy his reporting and essayist style, we can't help but admire the honesty he has towards his subjects and projects and the selection of details he teases out of any scene. Besides an accomplished essayist, he was also a novelist and short fiction writer, often writing for The New Yorker, GQ, McSweeney's, Harper's, and even Playboy, among many, many others. He is famous for using footnotes and endnotes lavishly in his writing, as I'm sure you have or will notice and consider The Lobster. Often, he said, the best parts, the most interesting details of a story or an essay can be found in the footnotes. Now, I know, most college students may balk at this, of course, thinking of their textbooks, but, I encourage you to take a look at those notes in a different way. Often footnotes aren't pushed to the bottom of the page because they're unnecessary, but often because they are tangential to the material. But aren't tangents some of our best jokes, our best stories, our best attempt at relaying information or an emotion? Take a look at the beginning of the essay, which is the layout of a setting. He orients us in time and space. We begin with the wide-ranging scope of the festival. First, he wants to make sure three things stand out to us: the size, the smell, and the popularity. These 3 points are explored in great detail throughout the rest of the essay. And before we get too into the nitty-gritty, always keep your eye on the sentence-level skill. Though it is a well-researched article, Foster Wallace still manages to bring light touches of humor and thought-provoking honesty, as we'll see later, into his prose. His line, Route 1, whose summer traffic is, as you can imagine, unimaginable, winks at the reader. He also places scenes next to facts. It makes for a very engaging read. He also uses the technique or tool of repetition. Consider page 236. He mentions the word lobster roughly 19 times on one page. This only underlines the excess of this festival. This is not your usual themed festival. This is a lobster festival with a capital L. You are entrenched in this experience as a festival goer, and we move through the event as he does, taking in sights, sounds, textures, tastes, and smells. We hear the shouting and the celebration. This is something that Foster Wallace excels at, immersing us in each of the senses. Often, writers tend to rely on sight and sound only, just narration and dialogue. This is the challenge for you in this course, CRW 2000, when you sit down to write. How can you incorporate touch into your piece? How may you incorporate taste? And the hardest sense to describe, how may you incorporate scent? Footnote. I mentioned scent is the hardest to capture because we often describe scent in metaphors of texture or taste. A lemon is citrusy, it is light and fresh and zesty, but what does each of these terms smell like? How is that description any different than describing an orange? End of footnote. Beginning on page 237, he treats us to the anatomy and then the history of the lobster, as a species and as a dinner option. But how are we able to identify why so many people love this creature if we know nothing about it? Foster Wallace is not only educating his audience, he is educating himself as well. And to what end? What does this research boil down to that, quote, lobsters are basically giant sea insects, end quote, mean towards this essay? Would the essay be lost without it? Yes, it would be. DFW and his audience are taking this journey together through this strange and otherworldly festival. It's a good trick, teasing out the extraordinary from the ordinary. He then blends the history of the lobster seamlessly into how we interact with this food source and, what does he call it? I think the garbagement of the sea. Today. Footnote. Did anyone else enjoy his blunt honesty about Taurus on page 240? End of footnote. We end this essay with an exploration of the question, what does it mean to feel pain? And also, how does he connect this aspect to the festival coverage? It is a giant celebration of eating lobster, one of the freshest foods we have on our American menus. We kill the lobster immediately before eating. We tend to boil or microwave them alive. Usually, it would be treated only as a recipe in an essay like this. Footnote. Foster Wallace does include a recipe on page 241, which nudges his curiosity of how a lobster may experience pain and therefore suffer, and how humans react to this situation. End of footnote. He mentions the process here. Quote, a detail so obvious that most recipes don't even bother to mention it is that each lobster is supposed to be alive when you put it in the kettle. This is part of the lobster's modern appeal. It's the freshest food there is. End quote. And here, he begins to explore his reaction to this process. Quote, most of us have been in supermarkets or restaurants that feature tanks of live lobsters from which you can pick out your supper while it watches you point. End quote. His essay is balanced at the end through the complicated pain versus suffering argument, and does a lobster experience either? It's a difficult technique. He realizes it would be very easy to fall into either camp, ignore or deny these questions and/or results, or to easily answer that it is animal cruelty. He writes to us, quote, I'm trying rather to work out and articulate some of the troubling questions that arise amid all of the laughter and salutation and community pride of the Maine Lobster Festival, end quote. He transcends these two sides, if there are sides at all, and instead lets his curiosity bleed onto the pages. This essay becomes personal to him. Not just about pain and suffering, but what we are willing to think about and to question ourselves as humans. He, unlike so many magazine fluff writers, requires something back from us, back from his readers. He asks us questions knowing full well these questions may be uncomfortable. It's the same requirement he has for himself. Each story and each essay, they each begin with a question that we must be fearless in asking our audience, and therefore fearless in asking ourselves. David Foster Wallace committed suicide in 2008, leaving behind one unfinished manuscript, The Pale King, which was published in 2011. If you enjoyed Consider the Lobster, I recommend his book of essays by the same title to you.